We started off this morning, I think, with a very strong, realistic note in the presentation that Martin Lees made, talking about challenges of unprecedented scale, magnitude, and complexity. And I think we all share that feeling that we really are dealing with, we really are at a period of tremendous challenge to humanity as a whole. Alexander Lickitall reinforced that and expanded on it, talking about multiple crises. Graham Maxton said business as usual. All the data reinforces the fact it is not an option. Alexander also made it clear that more of the conventional approach, more conventional road mapping is not going to deliver the goods, that we need rapid transition to a new model, he said, or paradigm, which involves not just energy and resource consumption, but economy and governance, society and leadership. A massive change in society of unprecedented magnitude. Many of the speakers agreed that the existing models are failing. Simply can't take us there. So far, I felt I was in familiar territory. I've heard and interacted on these themes very much. Then we started hearing a series of presentations. I'm not going to review them, and certainly, but talking about some of the things that have been achieved concretely, or are being achieved today, or can be achieved and are really within reach. Like we heard from Bill Ritter about the energy initiatives in Colorado and California and other places. Alexander mentioned we need a revolution in business, and he said, and it's happening. It's happening, at least it's starting. Franz Josef Rademacher talked about some concrete practical things like the gradual shift in transparency of ownership of property and how changing attitudes towards that transparency can have a real practical impact on society and behavior. Corinne Lepage said we have the tools and we have the means. But at the same time, there was an underlying theme that kept resurfacing in one presentation after another, something I think we all can resonate with, and we know there's truth in it. There are major obstacles in the way that are preventing us from doing all that we know we can do, or think we can do, or have the capacity to do. Governance was mentioned as a critical obstacle, and we flagged it, but we really haven't talked much about the solution yet. The need for leadership, the money, the impact of doing the right thing, climate or environment that it might have on people and society and incomes and living standards. The vested interests that are there in the society that will fight to hold on to the benefits, or even the question came up to preserve the inequality that they have. And another recurring theme, at least 3 or 4, maybe more speakers spoke to it, and we saw the scouts up here, which are a good representative of it, that the solution is not going to come solely or exclusively or maybe predominantly from government, that it really is going to require a grassroots effort of unprecedented magnitude at a global level. Well, when I try to put all of this together, I come up with a set of contradictions. Contradictory things. We've got an insoluble problem. We've got an urgency at the time. We've got tools. We've got means. We've got things that are being done. And we've got very, very serious obstacles that are resisting change. An Indian philosopher, Sri Aurobindo, once said that contradictions are complements. A Canadian mathematician, William Byard, who's written a very interesting book called Deep Thinking, says all creativity comes from confronting contradictions and being willing to hold those contradictions in our consciousness at the same time and look for ways, creative ways to reconcile them. And I think somehow, I don't know what the secret of the conference technology was, but I think this Green Cross has done a wonderful job in the mix of people and topics and in the contributions of speakers of presenting this as a real picture of opportunity and a real picture of crisis. And it is our task to help in ourselves and collectively to see how we reconcile these contradictions. And fortunately, we have one more day to do that. The first one has certainly been touched on, and that's money and financial markets. But I'd like to just make a slightly different point. A contentious point that money is not the obstacle to solving the problems. The world has about $225 trillion in financial assets. And when I say it's not the obstacle, I mean there's no shortage of money. Our problem is how that money is being utilized. Arguably, only about 20% of it now is really going into the real economy, into promoting human welfare, and a lot is having negative consequences. The rest is floating around. One of the fellows of the World Academy, Yehuda Kahan, he's an economist from Israel, who's been working in the insurance industry for many years. He's also a dynamic entrepreneur. He approached the world's largest insurance companies and pension funds about 8 years ago, 2006, as a preparation for Rio. And he said, look, if we don't address these environmental issues, who's going to lose the most? In terms of finance, it's going to be the pension funds and insurance companies who have about $70 trillion of financial assets. And the number one priority that they have to have is to preserve those funds for the future. And of course, if there is continuing increasing calamities and crises all over the world and increasing uncertainty, that's not an environment in which these long-term financial institutions can manage effectively their portfolios for the benefit of all the pensioners and insurees that own it. And so he said, we need arguably about, his figure was $4 trillion a year of investment in progressive efforts that will lead a transition to a new economy and a new society. You're reinvesting about $7 trillion a year. The bulk of those funds should come from you as the best sound, safe investment, not as a gift, not as aid, not as philanthropy, but as good business sense for the future. And he actually managed to get them to sign a convention in Rio, some of the largest companies committing to invest a few $1 trillion a year in this basis. Now, whether those investments are being made or not, the argument was compelling. They were convinced, and they gave them an award for presenting it. But I think it illustrates the point that it's not a lack of money that's holding us back from this transition. Second point I'd like to mention briefly is we've talked about employment, and for me, that's an absolutely critical issue. There's no solution to the future economy or future ecology that doesn't, first of all, ensure that people have a right livelihood. We cannot have a viable society, a stable society. We can't afford, we're going to have hundreds, now we're seeing a few million people coming from the Middle East. The migration patterns and everything will be just unimaginable if we don't address this point. I'm not going to go into it except to say, I believe there are solutions to that problem. Within the World Academy of Art and Science, we've been working on it for many years. And I'm just going to give one argument now. That we have a long list of unmet needs in the field of education and healthcare and in many other areas, social services and many other things. And we have a huge number of underemployed or unemployed human resources who could be utilized to meet those needs. So there's no inherent incapacity for us to raise living standards and improve well-being and welfare of people. We need a system that more effectively utilizes the resources that are there now in surplus to meet needs that are not being met. Whereas now, renewable scarce resources that are polluting the environment and taking away from the future and undermining human welfare, and we have incentivized programs to encourage that rather than encourage the shift to economic system that will really generate the incomes that people need as well as provide the services. Another issue that was mentioned was, which Alexander first flagged and a number of speakers did, I think Bill Ritter also, about that business has to play a critical role in this. And I agree with what he said. There is evidence. I'm a business consultant in my spare time, and there is evidence of a fundamental shift, not everywhere certainly, not with all companies certainly, but a significant, unprecedented shift in business to recognize that without taking responsibility for social consequences and impact on society and people, the future of business will not be very good. For most business will not be very good. Some of you may be familiar with the B Corp, or we call the for benefit corporations. As 4 or 5 years, half of the states have passed new legislation authorizing, legalizing corporations to do things that do not maximize their profits and to protect them from shareholder suits, from shareholders who will say you're not doing everything you can to maximize profit. Corporations today have a legal right to pursue non-financial goals and objectives. And this is a movement that needs to increase. And then my final point, and then I want to open it for the discussion, is about governance, because it was a recurring theme. We had a webinar about 10 days ago about the Greek crisis, and the question just kept coming up. Why is it that we are fighting against an economic ideology that was proven ineffective and discarded 70, 80 years ago? Where did this resurgence of neoliberalism, uncontrolled, unregulated free markets come from? And why are we arguing again something we learned in the 1920s? We learned in the Great Depression that this formula doesn't work, and yet we're fighting it again as if it's a first time. And I think if you look back, there are many answers to it, and it has a history. But for me, the fundamental turning point was the end of the Cold War. Because with the end of the Cold War, two things happened. Many things happened, but the two particularly. One was capitalism lost its complement. Capitalism lost anybody on the other side saying there's an alternative social model that should keep us reasonable and rational about the implications of our theory. Secondly, we had the opening up and globalization. And suddenly, corporations could move into the global markets in an unprecedented way beyond the regulation of any nation states or governments. We have a Wild West. And therefore, the issue of governance, there's no way I think we can tackle these issues without tackling the issue of global governance, which is a theme that was mentioned many times. At the same time, the issue of governance at the national level is a little different. And I think it was Bill Ritter, but there were others who also alluded to it. The fact of the matter is, what we call democracy, and I'm an American and I'm talking about my own country, but what we call democracy would be much more appropriately called plutocracy, because it's under the illusion that we are free and we are deciding things. It's really money that is deciding the policies that are met. And I don't think we're going to come to solutions without addressing these critical issues as part of an overall formula. So with that, I'd like to open it for questions, first to the panelists and then to the audience. Looking at the big picture, I'm trying to go beyond the wonderful practical suggestions, solutions, examples that have already been given. But just so we don't walk away from here or I don't walk away from here in exhilaration and wake up tomorrow morning and say, didn't we forget something? I'd just like to put the question on the table. What will it take? What do you think it will take to really make the magnitude of change and the magnitude in intensity and in scope, in reach of change needed for us to move to a new model or a new paradigm?